So it's December 5th, 2022, and you're standing on the banks of the Bosphorus Strait in Turkey, just, looking out at one of the busiest shipping lanes on planet Earth.
Yeah, the literal physical dividing line between Europe and Asia.
Right. And normally, it's this steady, just rushing artery of global trade. But today, if you look out at the water, you don't see that smooth flow of commerce at all. You just see this massive gridlocked traffic jam.
Oh, yeah. Dozens of these 1,000-foot-long oil tankers just sitting there, completely halted.
And, your first thought might be, I don't know, there's a military blockade or maybe a shipwreck blocking the channel. But no, the thing that stopped those massive ships in their tracks wasn't a gunboat. It was literally a PDF.
A PDF document.
Exactly, a document published on the website of the U.S. Treasury Department, over 5,000 miles away in Washington, D.C. So today we're unpacking this really fascinating stack of material centered around Edward Fishman's groundbreaking book, Chokepoints: American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare.
It's such a crucial read right now.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore how the globalized economy, which was originally built for free trade, has secretly been weaponized into this invisible battlefield.
I mean, it's a profound shift in how global power actually operates. We're looking at a fundamental rewiring of international relations where financial networks have, well, they've become just as devastating as traditional military arsenals.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I need you to walk me through that opening scene. How does a piece of digital paper in Washington physically stop a 1,000-foot ship in Turkey?
Yeah.
Like, what is the actual chain reaction there?
Well, it all comes down to the unseen plumbing of the global economy. So at 12:01 a.m. that morning, the United States and its allies instituted a $60 price cap on Russian oil.
Okay, to throttle the Kremlin's revenues after the invasion of Ukraine.
Right, exactly. The geopolitical goal was obvious. But the mechanism of how they achieved it relies entirely on private financial infrastructure. You see, the West holds this near monopoly on maritime insurance. British and European insurers cover more than 95% of all oil cargoes globally.
Wow. Over 95%.
Yeah.
So if you're sailing a giant, floating bomb of crude oil through a narrow, treacherous strait, you absolutely have to have that insurance.
Precisely. And the new Treasury rule essentially said, look, if you sell Russian oil above $60 a barrel, you instantly lose your Western insurance.
Oh, wow.
And so Turkish port authorities who oversee the incredibly dangerous Bosphorus Strait were suddenly terrified. I mean, they looked at these massive tankers and realized that if one of these uninsured ships runs aground and spills millions of gallons of oil,
Turkey would be stuck with the bill.
Exactly. They'd be left paying for a catastrophic multi-billion-dollar cleanup.
But wait, why does a private British insurance company care what a PDF from the U.S. Treasury Department says? I mean, they aren't American.
Well, because that British insurance company relies on the U.S. dollar to do business, if they violate the U.S. Treasury's rule, the U.S. government can threaten to cut them off from the American financial system entirely.
So they're held hostage, basically.
Basically, yeah. Faced with the choice of losing access to the U.S. dollar or dropping coverage for a few Russian oil tankers, the insurers dropped the coverage instantly. And without coverage, the Turkish authorities demanded physical proof of alternate insurance.
Which the ships obviously couldn't provide.
Right, so they were stopped dead in the water.
I mean, it's like someone in Washington simply turned off the easy pass for a foreign adversary.
Yes.
Just grinding their economy to a halt halfway across the world. No shots fired, no troops deployed, just a bureaucratic rule change that cascades through the system and paralyzes a superpower's main export.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is the incredible historical irony of this exact geographic location. Because controlling the Bosphorus is exactly how ancient empires used to win wars.
Yeah.
The geography hasn't changed at all, but the mechanisms of power have completely transformed.
Take us back to how this used to work. Like, set the historical stage.
Okay, let's rewind to the 5th century BC. Athens, which was the superpower of ancient Greece, relied entirely on the Bosphorus to import its food.
Specifically grain from Ukraine.
Yes, grain from the fertile fields of Ukraine. It was their absolute lifeline. And their great rival, Sparta, knew this. The 27-year Peloponnesian War finally came to an end, only when the Spartan navy destroyed the Athenian fleet at a place called Aegospotami.
Okay.
They physically seized control of the Bosphorus, physically blocked the ships and quite literally starved Athens into submission. The physical choke point was the absolute key to victory.
But wait, this is where I have to push back a little, because Sparta had to physically destroy an entire navy to block that strait. I mean, they had to build ships, train sailors, engage in this brutal hand-to-hand combat where thousands of people bled and died.
Right.
But in 2022, the U.S. didn't fire a single shot. They didn't risk a single soldier. They literally just updated a website. So how did a modern government get the power to remotely control global trade without military force? Where did that invisible power actually come from?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at the accidental architects of our modern financial system, the men who built the globalized economy in the late 20th century.
Who are we talking about here?
People like former Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan and a man named Walter Wriston, who was the incredibly influential CEO of Citibank.
And just to be clear for everyone listening, these guys were not trying to build weapons, right? I mean, they were pure capitalists.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, they believed they were making the traditional power of governments completely obsolete. So in 1992, Walter Wriston published a manifesto called The Twilight of Sovereignty.
Catchy title.
Yeah, very dramatic. His core thesis was that telecommunications, computers, and international bankers were building this galloping new system of international finance.
Oh.
And he believed that this system would become so powerful and so intertwined that national governments and politicians would simply lose their power to regulate national life. He honestly thought that market forces now ruled the world, not politicians.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Wriston thought he was building this open, borderless ocean for money to flow freely, right? But what he actually built was a highly centralized toll road system.
That's exactly it.
So how exactly did he build the toll booths? Like, what is the actual plumbing of this system?
That toll road analogy is spot on. Wriston and his peers wanted a seamless global economy, but, to make money move at the speed of light, they had to build centralized infrastructure.
Right, you need actual wires and servers.
Exactly. They accidentally created the very choke points this book is named after. Let's look at the plumbing of the U.S. dollar, which is the default currency for global trade. If a business in Japan wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they almost always price and settle that transaction in U.S. dollars.
Even though the U.S. has literally nothing to do with the transaction.
Correct. But here is the catch. Those U.S. dollars don't physically move in suitcases. When that electronic dollar transaction happens, it must clear through what is called a U.S. correspondent bank.
Okay, wait, what does that mean practically?
It means that almost every international dollar transaction at some millisecond physically clears through a computer server located inside the United States, managed by an American bank.
Oh, I see. And because that server is physically on U.S. soil, the U.S. government has legal jurisdiction over it.
Exactly. The Treasury Department has the legal authority to walk into that bank and say, do not process any transactions for this specific entity. With a literal keystroke, they can freeze funds halfway across the world.
Wow.
And it's not just the dollars, it's also the communication networks like SWIFT.
Right. I hear SWIFT mentioned in the news all the time. It's usually just described as a financial messaging system.
Yeah.
But mechanically, how does it actually act as a choke point?
Think of SWIFT like the global postal service for banks. It doesn't move the actual money it doesn't carry the package, it just carries the shipping label and the instructions.
Okay, so it's just the communication layer.
Right. When a bank in London wants to send money to a bank in Tokyo, they send a secure message via SWIFT that says, credit this account, debit that account. If you cut a nation off from SWIFT, their banks are suddenly blind and deaf.
So they might have billions of dollars sitting in an account, but they have absolutely no secure way to tell anyone to move it.
Exactly. So these private financial infrastructures were supposed to make the state irrelevant, but instead they gave governments, and specifically the U.S. government, unprecedented, almost godlike power over global adversaries. Because if you control the toll booth, you control the road.
Okay, but we should clarify for you, the listener, that economic warfare itself, like the concept of boycotts and embargoes, that isn't a new invention at all.
No, not at all. And this is where we need to look at how Thomas Schelling, the Nobel laureate and strategist, defines economic warfare. He defined it as subduing the enemy by imposing economic damage.
Okay, so just hurting their wallet until they give up.
Basically, the distinction between economic war and conventional war is entirely about how it is waged. For example, sanctioning an adversary's bank is economic war. Dropping a bomb on that exact same bank is conventional war.
But the geopolitical goal, shutting down the bank to hurt the enemy, is exactly the same.
Exactly.
Right, but I guess dropping a bomb leaves a smoking crater. Sanctioning a bank leaves the building standing, but the money inside is suddenly worthless.
That's a great way to put it. But while the idea is old, the sources point out that the history of economic warfare is essentially a 2,000-year history of catastrophic failures.
Walk us through some of those failures, because it's kind of shocking how rarely this strategy actually worked in the past.
Yeah, let's start in 432 BC, right
Right.
before the Peloponnesian War we just talked about. The Athenian leader Pericles issued the Megarian decree, which barred the rival city-state of Megara from Athenian markets.
An early embargo.
Right. And it starved the Megarians, yes, but it didn't prevent war. In fact, it backfired terribly. It convinced Sparta that Athens was reckless and had to be destroyed. It precipitated the exact war Pericles was trying to avoid.
But wait, what about empires that basically owned the world at the time? Take Napoleon. I mean, he practically owned Europe at his peak. You're telling me he couldn't successfully embargo Britain? How did an empire that powerful fail at economic warfare?
Well, because of the enforcement mechanism. In 1806, Napoleon tried to wage economic war against Britain with his continental system. It was an embargo prohibiting British trade with French-controlled Europe.
Okay, seems straightforward.
But it failed completely. Why? Because Britain controlled the physical seas. Without a way to police every single port and coastline, smuggling just became rampant. Napoleon couldn't enforce the physical choke point.
Which brings it to the 20th century.
Yes, and perhaps the most tragic failure. After World War I, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson championed the League of Nations, really believing that economic boycotts could be a silent, deadly remedy that would make military force obsolete.
Sounds great in theory.
But when the League tried to sanction Mussolini's Italy in 1935 for invading Ethiopia, the member nations were just too fractured. The political debate was entirely self-interested, and they selfishly exempted critical items like oil and steel from the embargo because they didn't want to hurt their own economies.
So they sanctioned everything except the stuff that actually mattered for a war machine.
Exactly. The sanctions were a complete joke. Mussolini got what he wanted, and many historians argue this glaring failure of economic deterrence directly emboldened Adolf Hitler.
Okay, so if the strategy failed from ancient Greece all the way up to the eve of World War II, why on earth is it America's go-to playbook today? Why bet the house on a strategy with a 2 millennia losing streak?
Because of the 1990s, the sources highlight the United Nations embargo against Saddam Hussein after he annexed Kuwait in 1990 as the true historical turning point.
What changed?
For the first time in history, the globe was actually interconnected enough and legally unific enough to truly devastate an adversary's economy without bombing it. Saddam's oil sales accounted for 60% of Iraq's GDP.
Oh, wow. 60%.
Yeah, and the international community, finally able to utilize those modern centralized financial networks we discussed earlier, cut him off almost entirely. The modern choke points had finally matured. Globalization itself had made the target vulnerable.
You know, here's where it gets really interesting. Because if the weapons have evolved from naval blockades to financial choke points, then the people fighting the war have to evolve too, right?
Right.
We aren't sending generals to fight this. Who are the actual commanders in this new type of war?
They certainly aren't generals or admirals. The commanders of today's economic wars are lawyers, diplomats, and economists. The book highlights key architects of this new arsenal people like Dalip Singh, Stuart LaVey, and David Cohen.
So these are just bureaucrats operating quietly out of the Treasury and Commerce departments.
Exactly.
And if they are the commanders, who are the foot soldiers?
Corporate CEOs.
Wait, really?
Yeah, imagine you are a bank executive or a tech CEO. You are simply trying to maximize profits, but suddenly you find yourself forced by federal law to comply with Washington's marching orders. The government issues the PDF, but it is the private sector CEOs who are actually the ones cutting off the accounts, halting the software updates, and denying the maritime insurance.
Okay, I want to walk through how a modern campaign actually unfolds without making it sound like we are just reading a textbook glossary here.
Yeah.
Let's say Washington wants to target a foreign entity, maybe a bank that's moving money for a weapons program. What is the very first weapon they pull out of the arsenal?
The first strike is usually what we call blocking sanctions. This is the nuclear option of finance. If Washington catches that foreign bank moving illicit money, they put them on a list. Instantly, any assets that bank holds in the U.S. are completely frozen. Furthermore, they are completely banned from making any transactions in U.S. dollars.
And since the dollar is the lifeblood of global trade, this essentially excommunicates the bank from the modern economy.
Exactly. It's a massive blow.
But what if that bank just pivots? What if they say, fine, we won't use American banks. We will just do all our business through a major bank in China or Europe. How does Washington stop that?
That is where they use secondary sanctions. This is where America truly flexes its global muscle. A secondary sanction forces foreign banks to make an impossible choice.
How does that work mechanically?
Mechanically, Washington issues an ultimatum to that Chinese or European bank. They say, look, you can continue doing business with the targeted bank, or you can have access to the U.S. financial system. You cannot have both.
Yeah.
Yeah. And given the sheer size and importance of the U.S. economy, every global bank will drop the target immediately rather than lose access to the U.S. dollar. It is a ruthless economic ultimatum.
So that covers the money.
Yeah.
But what about the actual physical stuff? Like, how does the U.S. stop an adversary from getting the computer chips needed to build advanced missiles or AI supercomputers?
Right. Well, for that, they shift from the Treasury Department to the Commerce Department using export controls like the Entity List and the FDPR, which stands for the Foreign Direct Product Rule.
Okay, unpack those for us.
Sure. If you are put on the Entity List, U.S. companies are legally barred from selling goods to you. But the FDPR goes a massive step further. It essentially asserts global jurisdiction over supply chains.
Explain how that works mechanically, because that sounds huge.
It is huge. It dictates that even if a product is made in a foreign country by a foreign company, if it was manufactured using any American technology, American software, or even American blueprints, it cannot be sold to the target.
Wait, really? So if a factory in Taiwan uses an American-made software program to design a computer chip,
the U.S. government claims the right to block the sale of that chip to an adversary. This is how the U.S. cuts adversaries off from advanced technology, which is, essential for modern supremacy.
and just a pause here, and I want to make this really clear for you listening, regardless of where anyone stands politically on these specific conflicts, whether it's Iran, Russia, or China, what's objectively fascinating here is just looking at the mechanics, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The book isn't making a moral judgment. It's just showing us the blueprints of how the Treasury Department actually executes these financial blockades across different administrations.
Yeah.
We're just reporting on the tools.
Exactly. And Fishman's book traces the development of these specific weapons across 4 distinct modern campaigns. First, the effort to halt Iran's nuclear program in the 2010s, which is really where the Treasury Department experimented with and perfected those secondary sanctions. Second, the response to Russia's initial imperial land grab in Crimea in 2014. Third, the ongoing campaign to thwart China's bid for technological mastery, which heavily utilizes the Entity List and the FDPR against targets like the tech giant Huawei and its CFO, Meng Wanzhou.
Okay.
And finally, the massive, unprecedented deployment of all these tools against Russia following its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
So what does this all mean? We have this incredibly powerful arsenal. We have bureaucrats who can freeze a nation's economy with a keystroke, utilizing the very plumbing of global capitalism. What is the long-term impact for you, the listener, and for the global economy we all rely on?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the United States operated for a long time under the assumption that it could use these economic weapons for free.
Like a magic bullet with no recoil.
Exactly. But the massive 2022 sanctions on Russia finally broke that illusion.
Makes me think of antibiotics, honestly.
Well, no, so.
It's like we discovered this absolute miracle cure for an infection, and we just started overprescribing it for everything. Every geopolitical headache, big or small, got a heavy dose of sanctions. But the more you use antibiotics, the more the bacteria mutate to survive. Are we creating economic superbugs?
That is a very accurate way to look at it, and it's exactly the concern raised by several veterans of America's economic wars in the text. Former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew specifically warned that the overuse of sanctions risks undermining America's leadership position in the global economy.
Because the targets adapt.
Right, because when you use these weapons so aggressively, the target nations don't just roll over and give up, they adapt, they learn.
They seek what the book calls economic security.
Yes. They realize the severe vulnerability of relying on the U.S. dollar, on U.S. correspondent banks, and on Western infrastructure like SWIFT. So adversaries, and frankly even some nervous allies, are now actively scrambling to build parallel financial systems.
So they're just opting out.
They're trying to. They are engaging in de-dollarization, they are building new domestic payment networks, creating alternative digital currencies, and establishing localized supply chains that don't rely on American software. All of this is designed for one single purpose: to be immune to U.S. choke points.
Okay, let's bring this all together. We have journeyed today from the ancient world where Spartan navies won wars by physically blockading the Bosphorus Strait to starve Athens, all the way to the 21st century, where bureaucrats in Washington leverage invisible financial networks and software rules to paralyze modern empires from behind a desk.
It's quite a journey, and the overarching warning of the book is that we are entering an era of severe economic fragmentation. The very use of these weapons is threatening to end globalization as we know it.
Meaning what, exactly?
We are seeing a world slowly dividing into separate, walled-off economic blocks, forcing the so-called swing states to pick sides between the U.S.-led financial system and the emerging alternatives being championed by countries like China.
Which brings us to a final, really provocative thought I want to leave you with, drawing on something the author calls the impossible trinity. The idea is that the West cannot simultaneously have economic interdependence, economic security, and engage in great power competition. You just have to choose.
It's a trilemma.
Right. So think about this. The United States built its economic weapons on the back of global interdependence. That borderless ocean of free trade that capitalists like Riston and Greenspan championed, right? But if the aggressive use of these weapons forces the rest of the world to decouple, to build their own walled gardens to protect themselves, will America's reliance on economic warfare ultimately destroy the very globalized economy that makes those weapons so powerful in the first place?
It raises such an important question because, if the toll road ceases to be the only route, the toll booth loses all its power.
Exactly. If everyone builds their own parallel road, suddenly that PDF published in Washington doesn't stop traffic on the Bosphorus anymore. The EZ Pass stops mattering entirely if nobody is actually using the highway. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a real pleasure exploring this with you.